Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And as you can see, today's topic is going to pick up right where we left off, that I teased, the culture of conformity. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. So, suburbanization, culture of conformity. You see, the 1950s is this almost mythic decade. It's a decade that many people choose to look back on with rose-tinted glasses. People like to believe that they were living a life as represented by the TV shows of the era. I love this picture here, envisioning the American dream. It's a Wheaties commercial. But look, you got your husband, your wife, your 2.3 kids, your nice lawnmower. Husband's got his sports equipment, including golf clubs, nice boat he can't afford behind him, and a pool all in their summer home backyard as he's working on the motor of a brand new motor to go on his boat that already has a motor. And these shows would idolize certain characteristics of the 1950s, such as the suburban communities in which they lived that were idyllic, lily white, like American Boyhood, the white picket fence. In fact, what it created was this myth of the 1950s. This myth that the 1950s were a decade that were free from social and political turmoil. In fact, talking heads will often refer to the decade of the 50s as the way it used to be. The good old days. But as is often true, the actual reality was actually quite different. This was a very dichotomous period between two visions of American society that we can see here illustrated through art. On the left is Norman Rockwell. On the right is a painting called Number 5 by Jackson Pollock. Now, you may remember I mentioned Jackson Pollock a few lectures back, as he was someone who studied underneath David Alfaro Siqueiros, the muralista of the 1920s and 30s who came to California. Now, these two paintings, though, there was a lot to support both of these ideas, especially the one on the left, which is kind of that mythic idea of the 1950s. Remember, this is called freedom from want, a people of plenty. Now, the post-World War II period did mark an incredible era of industrial economic growth. It was also the last decade in which the U.S. economy was primarily an industry-driven economy. As by the 60s and 70s, we began transitioning to service and information technology. The farm population fell from 23 down to just 15 million people as more and more people urbanized, or in this case, suburbanized. The average standard of living went up for everyone, average-wise. And why we'll get to why this area looked much more like the chaos depicted by Jackson Pollock, it is for the reason on the left that we tend to look at the period of the 1950s as rosy, as a time that we should emulate and get back to. Now again, reality was probably far more like Jackson Pollock. Chaos. Not really sure what's going on. Now, to understand why we kind of had this mythic idea of the 50s, to understand Norman Rockwell idea, to understand the culture of the 1950s, it really starts with one thing: suburbanization. Suburbs were not new in the 50s, but in the post-war years, there's an explosion in the suburban population. First of all, the dream of home ownership, which embodied the hope of a better future in life, came within the reach and reality of most Americans in the 1950s. Because of the growing demand for homes in the post-war years, home builders began to employ a assembly line type of process to standardize home building and cut costs. These homes were cheaper. They began to pop up on the outskirts of towns, on the outskirts of cities. Suburban developments began springing up nationwide, aided in part by the US government. The government began to sponsor really good deals on home loans, especially to World War II veterans, who purchased these homes with little to no down payment, in monthly payments as low as $56 a month. Compare that to an apartment in the city where you'd be charged $93 per month. So you could literally buy a home in the suburbs for almost half the price. And while these programs will be heavily used by Anglos to create a mythic, homogenized vision, white vision of America, African Americans and Mexicanos are often carved out of these programs by design. And as a result, suburbanization is largely a white movement to the suburbs. Hence the term historians use, this is white flight. Anglos are fleeing the cities, surrounding the cities in the suburbs, create a white, a lily white version of America. And it's all being done by being able to offer low prices, but only selectively giving it to potential home buyers. They want a beautiful suburbia. They want to have those, we talked about last time with the to secure these rights report, these racial covenants. But then it got more nefarious. It wasn't just the racial covenants. Look at this list. This is a lending guide for banks in regards to these government-backed loans. It created what's called a sliding scale. And this is for the Homeowners Loan Act, HOLA loans. And as you see here, the idea here was part of the bank's job was to make sure they would get a return on their investment. And so if they loaned you money to purchase homes in a suburban subdivision, they want to make sure that your property value stays steady or increases. What they don't want to have happen is see your property values decline and then have you not be able to sell your house and pay back your loan. And what they began to argue was that if they allowed people who were non-good neighbors, non-whites, non-proper Americans, that would decrease the value of homes in the subdivisions. And so in order to maintain property value, they create a ranking system regarding what would be a safe loan and that would protect property values at the same time for those neighbors around them. So the idea was that if you sold to an English person, a German or a Scot or an Irish or a Scandinavian, property value would be maintained. Northern Italians, very similar. Bohemians, Czechoslovakians, Poles, Lithuanians, Greeks, still doable, but not quite as safe a bet. They may or may not assimilate properly. Then you got the Russian Jews of the lower class, and the South Italians, and they're still white. Notice the bottom of the list, though, number 9 and 10. Negroes, followed by Mexicans. People of Mexican descent were even lower ranked than African Americans were. This act is extremely racist. But the impact was disastrous for people of color left behind. Because here's what happens when this takes place. When white flight takes place, when Anglos leave the cities and move to the suburbs, leaving behind people who can't move out, people of color. poorer socioeconomic categories and classes. When they leave the inner cities, they take with them not just the whiteness part of their race and ethnicity, they also take with them their tax money that is funding things like infrastructure, educational opportunities like schools that are mostly funded through local taxes, medical care, housing improvements, public pools. And there are some very big consequences to suburbanization. I want to show you the city of Houston because it's a city I know and know very well at this point, having lived in Houston for more than 10 years. And it becomes a very easy visualization tool here. So here's the city of Houston. And I remember when I first moved here, I was struck by the fact that it looks like a bullseye. Because you have the city of Houston in the center, then you have a ring around it called the 610 Loop. Then you have a ring around it that's called the Beltway, the Sam Houston Tollway. Then another ring around it that is now called the 99 Tollway that encompasses most of it. So you have these three circular rings that surround the city of Houston. And these highways coincide very nicely with the development of suburbs from the 50s and 60s. So let me be very clear here. Prior to World War II, the vast majority of people are going to live right here in downtown within what is now the 610 Loop. But then, as white flight takes precedent or takes hold in the post-World War II period, we start seeing more and more Anglos fleeing outside the 610 Loop. And again, here's the 610 Loop. Notice where all the Anglos, here's all the Asians, mostly down here on the southwest side. Here's all the Hispanics. Notice where all the Anglos are now. They are outside, not just the 610 Loop, but outside the Beltway Loop, all the way around. And of course, this is all being buttressed by those racial covenants we talked about last time. And even while those covenants become illegal by the 1970s, as people of color begin moving outside the 610 Loop, what did Anglos do? They moved further away. So let me examine, I want to use these maps now to examine how this takes place. So here's all these maps overlaid, okay, in modern day. But I want to go back to this map right here for a minute. So here's my cursor on my screen. So up until the World War II, almost all Anglos live within the 610 Loop. They build the 610 Loop post-World War II, and white flight begins. So all these Anglos begin moving outside the 610 Loop to what is now inside the Beltway. Now, so we're going to focus on the north for a minute here, moving up 59 and 45 right here. So they were living here within the Loop. After World War II, they move out of the Loop into this area right here. Notice this city area, this area here is not even an official city, but it's called the Aldine District. It's Aldine ISD School District. In the 50s, in the 60s, into the 70s, go into one of their schools that are the older high schools or look at their yearbooks. Almost every student you see on the wall from those decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, they're all white. They're all Anglo. Every one of them, with very few exceptions. So then by 1968, the government passes the Fair Housing Act that will help to eliminate those racial covenants. So by the 1980s and 70s and 80s now, when minority groups are now pushing out of the 610 Loop themselves, finally, they begin pushing into the Aldine District. So what do Anglos do? They push out further. They move beyond the Beltway into places like Humble, Kingwood. Now, if you know anything about the area right now, parts of Humble are becoming increasingly dominated by Hispanic and African American populations, especially if you're south of the river there, the San Jacinto River. Kingwood is still more white compared to the south side of Humble and the Humble ISD. So what happens again? They began pushing further out into places like the Woodlands, which again is predominantly Anglo in 2020, 2021. And of course, now we see some are doing the other thing that's going on, a new trend, which is moving back into the city and gentrifying the city centers, which is why you see, if I move my map to the current map, you see a huge cluster of Anglo-Americans on the southwest side in the richer Westheimer area of the city. In these penthouses, in these, new urban lofts that are becoming all trendy. And here's the thing. So as you move into Aldine and transition from, say, the 60s and 70s and early 80s, when the school population was largely Anglo, by the late 80s and 90s, now you're talking they're mostly Black or Hispanic, depending on which school you're talking about. And you look at Humble in the 80s and 90s, and Humble High School is all Anglo. But by the 2000s and 2010s, they're becoming darker and darker skin tones, more people of color, whereas Kingwood is still Anglo. And this is a trend that continues not just in Houston, but throughout the entire country, in every large city. And the problem is, when we look at these maps overlaid here finally, the problem is these inner city schools that are predominantly non-white or they're people of color will receive far less funding than the Anglo schools. These are reports from 2019. Mostly white school districts receive almost $14,000 per student, where non-white students or non-white schools receive $11,600 per student. That's technology. That's diversity of classes, AP advanced placement courses, dual credit options. Or as the top headline says in your report, finds predominantly white schools get $23 billion more than non-white ones. So this impact is drastic. Remember last week we talked about to secure these rights, about lack of opportunity? Thus, it says, where old ghettos are surrounded by restrictions and new subdivisions encumbered by them, there is practically no place for people against whom the restrictions are directed to go. And since these minority groups are forced into crowded slum areas and must ultimately have access to larger living areas, the restrictive covenant is providing our democratic society one of its most challenging problems. In other words, let me go back to my map of Houston really quick. White flight will create a white ring around a city, acting as a noose that will stave off investment into the inner cities, that will cut funding for schools that are predominantly people of color. And they have no way to get out. They aren't allowed to in the 50s and 60s into the early 70s by these racial restrictions and covenants. They aren't allowed to leave, even if they have the money. And what's left behind is no tax money now because all the people who were wealthier, who were Anglo, have left. Schools deteriorate, lack of educational opportunities. The fact that we're spending more money on predominantly white schools than non-white schools, even in the present day, means less academic opportunities for students. So it's funneling persons of color into menial or non-skilled labor jobs. Lack of public resources. Lack of access to clean water. See my hometown of Flint, Michigan for that. Building safety issues. Lack of recreational outlets like public pools or places for kids to expend healthy energy who will instead turn to gang violence because there's nothing else to do. They want to fight back against the system somehow that keeps them downtrodden. It's horrific what transpires. And When you think about that these racial covenants existed until 1968, officially they ended then, but we all know they still continue long past that as far as implementation of it. And so you're talking by the 70s. Guys, my brother and sister were born in 1969 and 1971, respectively. I was born in 1980, which means assume for a minute that I was a person of color who lived in the inner city of Houston. My parents would not have been allowed to leave the city based on these racial covenants. And again, I know I'm really white Anglo, I get that. But pretend for me, because I don't have anybody in class I can play off of in this video. My parents would not have been allowed to leave. That generation would not have been allowed to leave the city, which means I would have grown up most likely still in the inner city. Now, if by chance, because I was born 9 years later than my brother, maybe my dad had found a good job in the 70s, which my dad worked for General Motors. He had a good job. So maybe he, by the 1970s, would have been able to move out, or maybe when I was very young in the 80s, been able to move out to a suburb. Which means, hey, I might have been the first member of my family then to go to a suburban school in the 80s and 90s. In which case, I have two children who, as of this recording, are 7 and 2 years old. So I would have been just getting out of the urban ghettos. I would be the first generation to actually have a chance at a suburban education and go to a better school and college, hopefully. My kids would reap those benefits. But that means white flight, racial covenants are literally one generation removed. That's it. One generation from having access to suburban education. Even still, we know it still exists. First of all, racial covenants still exist. In fact, I just got an email last night on one of my academic Twitter groups I belong to, and it was a job opportunity somewhere in eastern Washington state where a professor was hiring to find a project manager to try to investigate and get rid of racial covenants that still exist for subdivisions. There's an article last year in the Houston Chronicle about, hey, the government under Joe Biden is going to finally allow us to easily get rid of racial covenants that still exist on paper. Now, most of them don't technically get enforced anymore. I mean, they're not being enforced, but they're still in the contracts because it costs money to hire lawyers to remove them. This is 2021, guys. 2022. And these things still are on paper existing. And of course, that's just what's written in the law. Then there's also de facto segregation, de facto white flight that still exists, where I can tell you, like when I was in high school, I played a lot of sports. I ran track, I ran cross country, I played basketball. I loved sports. But I knew as a student athlete that when we on the schedule, I look at the schedule every year for whether it was track or cross country or basketball or even the football. I knew by looking at the schedule, the name of the school, I could tell you the physical and demographic makeup of every school I play. I bet you could too. You knew if you were going to go play a school that was going to be a predominantly, quick, athletic African American team, or a, Mexican American team, or they're going to be, heavy white dudes who love football, who are farm boys. You know the difference, because that segregation, while not written in law, still exists based on usually on social economic categories with a tremendous impact. And again, we're still dealing with this issue. And again, I get it. I use myself as an example because I'm recording myself. And I say, I'm not black. I'm not Mexican at all. Or, Mexicano. So I never had to experience these things. I grew up in the suburbs. It was assumed that I would go to college. A foregone conclusion. But at the same time, if I've been born a person of color, that might not have been the expectation. Because I'd be still being the first generation if I was lucky to be in the suburbs. That's if I was lucky and my parents were able to move out. If not, I might be the first generation to move out. And then for my kids, would be the first generation to be the coming up in a suburban school with more opportunities. It's a very real issue. But nonetheless, this white flight creates a new culture within the suburbs. As Anglos set to define what was proper, what was normal, what was considered quintessential American culture. The rise of the suburbs also led to separate spheres once again for men and women. Men who lived in the suburbs would commute to work every day, leaving women in the private sphere of the home to rear children and maintain the house. As the white middle class suburbanized, Cold War society would see a return to the more traditional gender roles, with an emphasis on the nuclear family you see on the screen, especially in the middle and upper classes. Women were supposed to happily return to the homes in the post-World War II society, carry on as mother and homemaker. The man would return to his role as breadwinner, and the children would be raised to fulfill their prescribed gender roles. However, it should not come as a surprise that many women found this to be very unsatisfying and unrewarding. In one way we actually know about this is the study of tranquilizer use during the 50s. So, as the statistics show, that tranquilizer use among prescription use in 1955 was virtually non-existent. But by 1958, consumption of tranquilizers reached 462,000 pounds per year. By 1959, it soared to 1.15 million pounds of tranquilizers being prescribed, in which physicians came to see tranquilizers as a uniquely female need to deal with the pressures, confinement of suburbia. And of course, where do we find this new idea of cultural conformity? Yes, from fear of communism, but also from consumerism that reinforces this conformity. Consumerism, we talked about in the 1920s, it took root, but affluence was more widespread by the 1950s. Ownership of consumer goods became personally defining. I mean, think about it nowadays, how people identify with things that they own, whether it's the Jordan shoes or iPhones or what, are you an Android user or you're a Mac user? And along with this came with the ideas of a technology boom in the 1950s with clothes and washing machines, more powerful vacuum cleaners, home freezers, air conditioning, jet travel. And while these things were not harmful in and of themselves, the purchasing and advertising surrounding them reflected and reinforced a very specific view of the United States. One was that you had to have these things and that you should buy them on credit. And consumer debt soared. And by the way, just to reinforce women's role, women were not allowed to have a credit card in their names. They had to have it in their husband's name. Advertising culture was rampant. I love these. I love them to look at it and use them to teach with, but they're horrific. The one on the right, the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. Really? And notice all these pictures. It's a woman doing housework wearing a cute dress. Because ladies, you always want to get dolled up and dressed up with makeup and do your hair and nice clothes so you can clean the house. What these do is they reinforce a very gendered view of society, separate spheres for men and women as homemakers, often failing. Don't worry, darling, at least you didn't burn the beer. And this is being reinforced not only by advertising, but on television. By the 1950s, 90% of families owned a TV, allowing images of this middle-class suburban society to permeate the country. TV replaces newspapers as the main source of news. It becomes a primary leisure activity, changing eating habits with a TV dinner, and pushes advertising in the homes of every American, but not just the commercials. The shows themselves, like Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, exemplifying this suburban mentality of what proper Anglo suburban life should be. This is also reinforced by another new phenomenon, like car culture. The car culture of the 50s would vault automobile and oil companies to the top ranks of corporate America. Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, the largest employer of both Mexican American and African American employees, had over 62,000 employees in one building, one complex. Cars transformed American life. The creation of the interstate highway system made long distance travel possible. The creation of hotels and motels, drive-in movie theaters, fast food dining. McDonald's was created in 1954. And they exploded to 700 franchises within a decade. But what this also reinforced was a white consensus culture. As historian Eric Foner says, the car symbolized the identification of freedom with the individual mobility and private choice. In other words, when you're in your car, you get to choose who's next to you. And if you think about when you turn 16, I remember when I turned 16, I can finally play the music I want to play without my parents having to control the radio. But take that one step further, not just music. What about the person in the passenger seat next to you? Do you want to ride with someone? And if you do have a passenger, do you want them to be a person of color? Whereas if you're a poorer person, or you live in the cities, you have to maybe ride mass transportation. You don't get to choose who's next to you. You'll rub elbows with poorer people, people of color, people of different religions and backgrounds and ethno-racial groups and different national origins. The car symbolizes individuality, personal freedom, private choice. You can pass by those blighted areas, the slum areas, the barrios, and the words of Truman's report, the ghettos. You don't have to look at them. How many times in big cities like Houston do you drive through the city and just ignore the tent cities of homeless people that live under the viaducts and overpasses? You can do that in a car. You can ignore it all. Ignore the non-white culture that you want to, well, forget. All of this, in other words, created a very specific, almost idyllic view of what America should be. But it did not reflect or include people of color. It created and reinforced a very specific Anglo form of this culture of conformity. And anything that fell outside of this was immediately viewed as suspect at best, branded communist at worst. When we come back, we will talk more about this fear that this creates. But until then, take care and bye-bye.